On a warm June evening in the year 1906, beneath the glittering lights of the Madison Square Garden rooftop theater, a sudden crack split the hum of music and laughter. One man fell, lifeless, his white waistcoat blooming with blood. In that moment, as gasps rippled like wind across the summer air, the name of a young woman, Evelyn Nesbit, was bound forever to what would be called the crime of the century. Welcome, dear listener. Wherever you are and whenever this voice reaches you, I invite you to pause for a moment and share in the weaving of memory. Leave a trace in the tapestry by writing where you listen from, and at what hour of your day or night you find yourself here. And if this gentle unfolding of lives from the past speaks to you, I invite you to press the subscribe button so that our circle of remembrance may continue to grow. The story begins not with the echo of gunfire, but in a dim boarding house far from the brilliance of New York. Long before her face graced magazines, before artists vied for her presence, before men of power and wealth entangled her in their rivalries, Evelyn was simply Florence Evelyn Nesbit, a fragile child of modest birth in the quiet hills of Pennsylvania. She entered this world in December of 1884 in the small town of Tarentum, though her earliest years unfolded near Pittsburgh. Her father, a struggling lawyer, carried the fragile hopes of a middle-class dream, but his death, when she was still a young girl, cast the family into sudden poverty. What does a child understand of loss? Perhaps only the empty chair, the silent absence at the table, the way her mother's voice grew tight with worry. Her mother, widowed and left with Evelyn and her younger brother Howard, took to small labors, teaching music, keeping lodgers, moving from one uncertain place to another. The scent of coal smoke lingered in the winter air, and in those days America's cities were restless, filling with industry and noise. Yet for the Nesbits, survival itself was a restless task. They moved like drifting leaves from Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, searching for footholds against hardship. In those unsettled rooms, Evelyn learned early the weight of hunger, the strain of unpaid rent, and the way beauty could sometimes soften hearts, if only for a moment. She was a striking child. Those who glimpsed her in the street or in the pews spoke of her delicate face, her eyes deep as if carrying questions far older than her years. Neighbors remarked on her quiet poise, her slender form. In times of need, her mother, understanding both opportunity and necessity, began to dress her in ways that drew notice, for even then, the gaze of others was a currency of its own. What must it have felt like to realize, before she was grown, that one's appearance might serve as bread on the table? The line between nurture and exploitation is often fine, and in poverty it grows almost invisible. Evelyn was still very young when she first posed for a neighbor who sketched. The act seemed harmless, sitting still, letting the eyes of another rest upon her while lines were drawn on paper. Yet in that simple act the course of her life began to take form. One could say she was born into the modern age of images. The century was turning, and with it came magazines, lithographs, photographs, new ways of spreading faces into thousands of homes. America was ready for its first celebrities, not only politicians or generals, but figures of beauty, muses whose images stirred dreams. And Evelyn, scarcely more than a child, would become one of the earliest. Her father's death had left a wound deeper than finances. Without his guidance, without stability, Evelyn's world was shaped by her mother's urgent choices. Mrs. Nesbit, determined to provide, recognized what others saw, that Evelyn's beauty could bring opportunity. There was no malicious intent, perhaps, only desperation mixed with hope. And so Evelyn, still on the threshold of adolescence, found herself carried into the studios of artists in Philadelphia. She sat beneath tall windows where sunlight angled across canvases, her stillness framed by the smell of oil paint and the quiet scrape of brushes. To those artists, she was both subject and symbol, the embodiment of youth and grace. To her, perhaps, it was simply work, another way to help her family survive. But work that demanded stillness, patience, and a surrender of self. Imagine her there, her hair coiled loosely, her hands folded in her lap, while strangers studied her form with professional devotion. Did she feel pride at the admiration? Did she feel unease as men twice, even thrice her age, leaned close to capture the curve of her cheek? Beauty, when turned into labor, has its own strange burden. It brings attention, yet attention is not love. It brings gifts, yet gifts are not freedom. And for Evelyn, attention would prove a double-edged fate. The years pressed onward, and the family's journey eventually led them toward New York City, that restless heart of ambition and spectacle. Evelyn was not yet grown, and yet she was already marked for a path that would carry her far beyond the shadows of poverty. Her mother sought introductions, secured her daughter opportunities in shops, in studios, wherever beauty could be exchanged for coin. The boundary between protection and ambition blurred, and Evelyn, still learning who she was, became instead what others desired to see. By the close of the 19th century, America was shedding its old skin. Wealth glittered in mansions along Fifth Avenue, while factories roared with the labor of immigrants. In that age of steel and marble, beauty itself became a commodity. It was displayed in magazines, paraded on stages, whispered about in parlors. Evelyn's youth, her delicate features, her air of both innocence and allure, made her a perfect vessel for the dreams of a restless society. She did not yet choose this role. It was chosen for her, as roles so often are for the young and powerless. And yet, even as she was placed in the gaze of others, Evelyn remained a child who longed for safety. Her father's absence had left a hollow that no stage or painting could fill. One wonders, did she ever dream of a quiet home, of days unmarked by scrutiny, of simple affection untouched by hunger or ambition? Perhaps in moments of solitude she did, but the current of her time and the determination of her mother pulled her steadily toward a different destiny. In memory's eye, one can still see her, in the faint light of a rented room, the walls thin, and the winter chill seeping through cracks. She sits with her younger brother, whispering of hopes, while their mother hums faintly at the stove. Outside, carriages clatter on cobblestones, and the world grows restless with change. Within, a girl who would one day be called the most beautiful face in America rests her head on a pillow, thin with wear. Her life has barely begun, yet the tide has already turned. The lamp flickers, shadows stretch across the room, and so our story begins, in poverty and loss, in a world where beauty could both save and destroy. The lamp flickers, shadows stretch across the room, and in the faint shimmer of that unsteady glow, the outline of a young girl can be imagined, her face caught between innocence and the burdens of survival. That image of dim light and watchful eyes lingers as we follow her into the next chapter, where other eyes, more numerous and more discerning, would soon turn upon her. For it was in the studios of New York, filled with the scent of turpentine and plaster dust, that Evelyn's face first began to travel beyond the small walls of her home, carried into the imaginations of strangers who had never heard her name. The city at the turn of the century was a great, unrelenting tide. Crowded streets hummed with the shuffle of immigrants, the clang of trolley bells, and the deep hum of industry. Buildings rose higher each year, pressing toward the sky in defiance of old limits. It was here, amid this restless surge, that Evelyn and her family arrived. They were one of many widowed households clinging to hope, one of many sets of children pressed by hunger into the working world before childhood had ended. Yet unlike so many, Evelyn carried with her something intangible, something that the new century valued more than ever before, a beauty that could be shaped, displayed, and sold to an eager public. She was still a child when she was introduced to the world of artists. Some said she was only 14, others 15. Too young, always too young. But the city did not pause to ask if her shoulders could carry the weight. The studios were filled with tall windows that captured the pale northern light, ideal for sketching and painting. Canvases leaned against walls, some half-finished, some abandoned. The air was heavy with linseed oil, charcoal dust, and the faint acrid tang of varnish. It was in such rooms that Evelyn sat, motionless for long hours, her features studied and transcribed, her presence turned into line and form. Her mother, both watchful and ambitious, encouraged this path. Perhaps she saw it as safety, a gentler labor than factory work or shop counters. Perhaps she believed that these rooms of cultured men and women were less threatening than the raw streets outside. Or perhaps she understood, with the sharp clarity of the desperate, that her daughter's face could provide in ways no other resource could. And so Evelyn became an artist's model, her youth frozen in sketches that would soon find their way into magazines and advertisements. The experience was layered. On one hand, there was a kind of dignity in being chosen, in sitting as still as marble while others struggled to capture what seemed effortless in her. She became the subject of study, the spark that guided the artist's hand. There was admiration in the glances, praise murmured as brushes swept across canvas. On the other hand, there was also a silence in which she was not a person, but a form, a composition of lines, a commodity. Did she wonder as she sat hour after hour whether anyone in those rooms ever sought to know her beyond the angle of her cheek? Did she long for someone to speak her name with gentleness rather than transaction? The first photographs soon followed. Cameras, then still a relatively new invention in the popular imagination, had begun to flood magazines and postcards with likenesses. Photographers found in Evelyn a subject of rare delicacy, a face that seemed to carry innocence and suggestion at once. The shutter clicked, a sound like a brief gasp, and her image was fixed. Unlike a painting, which took hours of gaze and labor, the camera snatched her essence in a moment. That difference would prove crucial. For Evelyn's beauty was not to remain confined to studios. It was destined to circulate, reproduced again and again, until her face became familiar to thousands. She appeared in advertisements for soap, for fashion, for luxuries that her own family could never afford. Men across the city, perhaps across the country, glanced at her image without knowing her name. She was an emblem, a symbol of refinement and modern charm. And yet she remained in her mother's modest rooms at day's end, returning from sessions with small earnings clutched tight. The gulf between the fantasy she represented and the reality she lived must have been vast. And one cannot help but ask, what did Evelyn think, seeing her own likeness spread across glossy pages while she still counted pennies for rent? It was in these years that she first entered the chorus lines of New York's theaters. The stage was bright, the music lively, the costumes glittering with sequins. To be a chorus girl was to be both admired and dismissed, essential to the spectacle yet easily replaced. For Evelyn, it was a continuation of what modeling had already taught her. Her value lay in her presence, her appearance, the way she could catch the eyes of men in velvet seats. The applause was distant, not personal, a roar that consumed all the girls at once. Yet to stand under those lights, even briefly, must have filled her with a sensation unlike the silence of the studio. There was movement now, sound, the rush of performance. The difference between being looked at in stillness and being seen in motion is subtle, but perhaps it brought a glimmer of vitality to a young girl, otherwise trapped in the quiet exploitation of posing. In those theaters, the air was thick with smoke and perfume, the laughter of patrons echoing from plush balconies. Evelyn's slender form and luminous face soon drew attention beyond the stage. Among the audiences were artists, journalists, men of wealth and power. They whispered her name. They pointed her out. She was no longer merely one among many. She was becoming singular, recognizable, desired. The currents of fate were already gathering around her, unseen yet inexorable. What must it have felt like to be so young and already the object of fascination for a city? Did she revel in it, finding freedom from poverty in the knowledge that she was admired? Or did she sense, even then, the dangers of being too visible, too desired by those who wielded influence? The line between opportunity and peril is never sharp, and for Evelyn it was blurred almost from the beginning. The click of the camera shutter still echoes. That moment, frozen and multiplied, became her passage into fame, but it also became her entrapment. For once an image is loosed upon the world, it can never be retrieved. The face belongs not only to the one who bears it, but to everyone who gazes upon it, reshaping it in their own desire. And so we leave her in this moment, sitting still under the studio lights, her eyes fixed beyond the artist's shoulder, while the scratch of charcoal and the faint snap of a camera shutter inscribe her into history. Outside, the city rattles with carriages and the call of newsboys. Inside, a young girl waits, already becoming an icon, already being claimed by a world that will not let her go. The click of the camera shutter still echoes. That sudden grasping of her likeness, fixed in an instant and multiplied on glossy paper, lingers in the air as though it were not merely a sound but a doorway. And through that doorway we enter another chamber of her life, where the shutter's stillness gives way to music and movement, and where the quiet rooms of the artist's studio dissolve into the dazzling glare of Broadway. For if the studio had taught Evelyn the weight of stillness, the stage would now teach her the power of motion and the peril of being both seen and unseen at once. In the first years of the 20th century, the theater was more than entertainment. It was a mirror of society's longings and its extravagance. Lights burned brightly above velvet seats, orchestras swelled in the pit, and the chorus line glittered like a row of carefully arranged jewels. Into this shimmering display Evelyn stepped, not yet a woman, still more a girl, her slender form draped in costumes that sparkled beneath the gaslight. To the audience she was one among many, but to those with keen eyes she already stood apart. Her face, so delicate and finely wrought, carried a magnetism that could not be hidden in a chorus of others. The world of the chorus girl was filled with contradictions. On stage they were bright, adorned, radiant, the embodiment of charm. Off stage they returned to small boarding houses, rooms scarcely more luxurious than those of the immigrant families who crowded the same streets. Their beauty was their labor, their youth a currency. They practiced routines until their feet ached, until the music echoed in their bones. Yet for all their effort, their names were often lost, replaced by the collective identity of the girls. It was a life both intoxicating and precarious, promising visibility but offering little safety. For Evelyn, the stage was not simply a profession. It was also another threshold into the gaze of powerful men. The theaters of New York were attended not only by common crowds, but by the wealthy elite. From velvet boxes and high balconies, men of influence watched the chorus with eyes that measured and selected, as if from a marketplace of beauty. It was in these spaces that Evelyn's image began to draw attention beyond the lights of the stage. Her likeness had already passed through studios and magazines. Now her living presence could be witnessed in motion, her figure outlined against music and laughter. The applause that filled the theater was distant, a roar that swallowed individual identity. Yet now and then, Evelyn must have felt the heat of a gaze that lingered on her alone. Imagine her there, amid the costumes of feathers and sequins, her cheeks warmed by rouge, her lips painted to catch the glow of light. The orchestra strikes. The line of girls moves as one. Yet Evelyn's eyes glance upward to the balconies, where shadows of gentlemen lean forward with interest. What does a girl feel in such a moment? Is it triumph, knowing she is singled out from a crowd? Or is it dread, sensing that the gaze carries with it desires she cannot command? Perhaps it was both, mingled together in a way she could not yet name. The atmosphere behind the curtain was different. There, in cramped dressing rooms, laughter and whispers mingled with the smell of powder and the rustle of skirts. Stories were shared, secrets guarded, dreams confided in hushed tones. Among the chorus, Evelyn was admired, perhaps envied for the attention she drew. But attention is not always fortune. Already she must have felt the weight of expectation pressing in, the awareness that to be beautiful was not simply to be admired, but to be pursued, claimed, even consumed. And still she was scarcely more than 15, balancing on the edge of childhood and womanhood, thrust into a world where innocence itself was a commodity. Broadway's energy was intoxicating. Outside the theater, the streets glowed with electric lights, the first flickers of a modern city alive at night. Newsboys cried out headlines, carriages clattered, music spilled from saloons. Inside, the audience surrendered to the spectacle, forgetting the grime and struggle of daily life in the brilliance of song and dance. Evelyn's role in this great illusion was both essential and invisible. She was part of the machinery of enchantment, and yet within her lay the seed of something more. Even then, whispers began to circulate. Who is the girl with the delicate face, the luminous presence? Her name, Evelyn Nesbit, began to emerge from the blur of anonymity, carried on tongues from backstage corridors to the salons of the wealthy. There is a peculiar cruelty in the way fame begins. It does not arrive as recognition of character or accomplishment, but as a murmur about appearance, a fascination with surface. For Evelyn, it was her face, her form, her aura of innocence that became the subject of talk. But innocence, once remarked upon, is never safe. To be called innocent is to invite the desire to possess, to corrupt, to claim. Did Evelyn sense this, standing in the wings, hearing the applause fade as the curtain fell? Did she sense that the very quality that drew admiration might also bring danger? The applause fades now into silence. In that silence, we feel the faint vibration of possibility, the sense of a life on the cusp of something larger and more perilous. The theater has shown her to the city, and the city has begun to remember her face. Soon that memory will draw her into the orbit of men whose wealth and power would shape her destiny in ways she could not have foreseen. For now, we leave her under the dim backstage lamps, removing sequins from her costume, the echo of clapping hands still trembling in the air. The sound is faint, muffled, like a memory already receding, yet it will carry her forward into encounters from which there will be no turning back. The applause is faint, muffled, like a memory already receding. And from that soft hush, we move into another space, where the sound of clapping hands gives way to the rustle of silk, the swish of fabric drawn across polished floors, the subtle creak of doors that lead not to crowded theaters, but to private chambers of wealth. It was here, in the hidden rooms of New York's great houses and secret apartments, that Evelyn encountered a man who would forever alter the course of her life. Stanford White, an architect of marble palaces and velvet interiors whose power reached as far as his appetites. Stanford White was a man of contradictions. To the public, he was a figure of grandeur, one of the celebrated architects of McKim, Mead, and White, designers of monumental buildings that gave the city its modern face. His hand-shaped Madison Square Garden itself, the very place where Evelyn would later watch his life end. He was praised for his artistry, admired for his charisma, welcomed into the highest circles of society. Yet behind this polished image lay another world, one filled with secret rooms, lavish parties, and an appetite for beauty that was not limited to sculpture or design. White had a gift for creating spaces that seduce the senses. Velvet curtains, mirrored walls, soft lights. But within those spaces, he wove his own desires. Evelyn was still scarcely more than a child when White first noticed her. Some say he saw her photograph in an artist's studio, others that he watched her from the audience of a chorus line. However it began, his interest was immediate and determined. He arranged introductions, spoke to her mother, invited them both to dinners. His charm was undeniable. He knew how to present himself as a benefactor, a cultured gentleman eager to support a struggling family. For Mrs. Nesbit, burdened with debt and uncertainty, the attentions of such a man must have seemed providential. Here was wealth, refinement, the promise of stability. Yet beneath the kindness there lurked another design. Imagine Evelyn at one of those dinners, seated at a table heavy with silverware and crystal glasses. The scent of fine food mingles with perfume. The chatter of guests flows around her. She is dazzled, perhaps overwhelmed, a girl accustomed to small rooms and simple meals, suddenly thrust into luxury. White is attentive, his conversation warm, his eyes alight with admiration. To a young girl, fatherless and adrift, his attention might have felt like protection, even affection. Yet protection can conceal possession, and affection can mask control. Did she understand, even dimly, that she was being drawn into a web she could not escape? There was a particular room, spoken of in whispers, where White kept a red velvet swing suspended from the ceiling. Mirrors lined the walls, silks draped across the floor. To some, it was a symbol of decadence, to others, a playground of fantasy. To Evelyn, it became the site of memory, both enchanting and haunting. She was a child lured into a world of games and gifts, where the line between generosity and exploitation blurred until it vanished. White's attentions wrapped around her like silk, soft, luxurious, but binding all the same. What does it mean to be so young and to become the focus of a man whose age and power dwarfed her own? Some say she was a victim, seduced and used before she could understand. Others argue she consented, that she enjoyed the gifts, the glamour, the escape from poverty. But can consent exist where childhood lingers, where power is so unevenly held? The truth lies in shadows, not in clear lines. What remains certain is that Evelyn, at an age when most girls are still learning the first steps of independence, was already entwined with a man whose influence would shape her destiny in ways neither could yet imagine. Her beauty became his possession, her innocence, his conquest. He dressed her in silks, commissioned portraits of her, paraded her before select friends as if she were both muse and prize. And yet there were moments when she must have felt a kind of warmth in his presence, for White was not only a predator, but also a man of charm and wit. He could be gentle, attentive, almost paternal. Perhaps she found in him a fleeting echo of the father she had lost, a man who offered safety amid the chaos of the city. The tragedy lay in the duality, that what seemed like care was also exploitation, that what felt like sanctuary was in truth a cage. The rustle of silk grows louder in our imagination, the sound of fabric shifting across a chamber floor. It is the sound of secrecy, of doors closed against the world, of moments that would later be recounted in courtrooms and newspapers with lurid fascination. Yet in this moment, for Evelyn, it was simply the world she had been drawn into, a world of luxury tinged with unease, of beauty entwined with danger. She could not yet know that the very man who adorned her with gifts would one day be struck down before her eyes, nor that his death would seal her name forever in scandal. And so we leave her here, in the velvet-draped room, the swing gently swaying, the silk whispering against polished wood. Outside, the city surges with life, unaware of the hidden dramas within. Inside, a young girl stands at the threshold of a story that will soon sweep her into its darkest turns. The silk whispers against polished wood, a sound secretive and close, as if confined within walls that hold too many memories. From that murmur of fabric we move outward, to the faint crackle of pages turning, the dry flutter of paper in lamplight. For beyond the chambers where mirrors multiplied her image, Evelyn's likeness began to circulate in another way. On the pages of magazines, on the canvases of artists, on postcards that passed from hand to hand. Her beauty, once hidden in private rooms, was now rendered for the public, a face to be owned by the gaze of countless strangers. It was a strange immortality, one she never chose, yet one that defined her life. The age into which Evelyn stepped was hungry for images. America at the dawn of the 20th century was a land of rapid invention and restless desire. Magazines grew thick with illustrations. Advertisements promised refinement through beauty. Artists searched for models who could embody ideals larger than life. Evelyn's delicate features, her wide eyes that suggested both innocence and mystery, became a canvas upon which others projected their visions. Painters like James Carroll Beckwith set her likeness in oils. Illustrators transformed her into the archetype of the Gibson girl, that tall, elegant yet youthful figure who represented the new American woman. Though Evelyn herself was small in stature, her face carried the aura of this ideal, and so she was lifted into a symbolic role she did not seek. What is it to be called a muse? The word carries both honor and burden. To inspire creation is to be seen as a source of light, yet it also means to be consumed, to be reduced to a symbol rather than a self. Evelyn's face smiled from magazine covers that she may never have held in her own hands. To men in parlors, to women dreaming of fashion, she became a vision of aspiration. And yet in her own rooms, the rent remained uncertain, the meals modest. The gulf between the image and the life was vast, and in that gulf a silence grew. Imagine her walking past a newsstand, catching sight of her own likeness in lithograph, staring back at her from rows of papers. What thought would pass through her mind? Did she feel pride, a flicker of triumph that her beauty had carried her from poverty into renown? Or did she feel dislocation, as though the face on the page were not truly hers, but belonged to a world that had claimed her without consent? Perhaps she felt both, pride mingled with estrangement, as anyone might when their private self is turned into public symbol. The artists who sketched her praised her stillness, her ability to hold a pose for long hours, her face serene, even when weary. Yet what serenity can a child possess when she is watched so intently, when her every feature is studied not for who she is, but for what she represents? In her silence, perhaps, she pondered questions no one asked her. What is beauty for if it does not bring safety? What is admiration worth if it cannot ease the ache of uncertainty? To inspire, to be admired, to be desired. These brought little comfort when night fell, and the small boarding room closed around her once more. As her image spread, Evelyn's presence on stage grew more celebrated. Patrons began to seek her name, to ask for her by reputation. The photographs that had once been simple keepsakes for artists now multiplied, reaching into parlors and galleries, into the imaginations of strangers across the country. She became one of America's first modern celebrities, though the word itself was still finding its shape. In her, society discovered the power of fame detached from accomplishment. She was known not for a great performance, nor for a singular achievement, but simply for her face, her form, her aura of youth. And so the culture of celebrity began, with Evelyn at its dawn, both radiant and trapped. The question remains, one that lingers like the shadow of ink on paper. Was she a muse or a commodity? Artists spoke of her as inspiration, praising the purity of her form. Publishers spoke of her as opportunity, knowing her likeness sold copies. Theater managers spoke of her as attraction, a name that drew patrons. To each, she was valuable, but seldom as herself, always as symbol, as surface, as mirror of desires not her own. In this way, Evelyn's beauty became a kind of currency, exchanged and multiplied, while the person within the image remained unseen. The pages continue to flutter in our mind's ear, the sound of magazines being turned, of portraits unveiled. Each carries her likeness further into the world, further from her control. And in that restless turning lies the seed of her future. For it was this fame, this widespread recognition, that would draw the gaze of men whose desires ran deep and dangerous. Already her name was whispered in circles of wealth. Already her face was marked as prize. She could not know it then, as she sat still for another sketch or smiled faintly for another photograph, but each image carried her further into a destiny entwined with scandal. We leave her here, in the half-light of a studio, a page torn from a magazine drifting to the floor, the ink of her likeness fresh and sharp. Outside, the presses thunder with the weight of mass production, spreading her image into the hands of strangers. Inside, she is silent, wondering perhaps who she is beyond the face they all have claimed. The page lies unsettled on the floor, its edges curling upward, waiting for the next breath of air to stir it again. The page lies unsettled on the floor, its edges curling upward, waiting for the next breath of air to stir it again. And as the air shifts, we hear another sound, heavier and more deliberate than the whisper of paper. It is the tread of footsteps in a corridor, firm and insistent, drawing nearer with each moment. Those footsteps belong to a man who would soon occupy the center of Evelyn's life, a man whose passion burned not as a gentle flame, but as a consuming fire. His name was Harry Thaw, heir to fortune, burdened with torment, a man whose gaze upon Evelyn was not admiration but possession. Harry Thaw was born into wealth, his family rooted in the coal and railroad fortunes of Pittsburgh. From childhood, he lived in the shadow of immense privilege, yet his nature was marked by volatility, suspicion, and a restless hunger for control. Accounts from those who knew him spoke of instability, of rages that erupted suddenly, of obsessions that would not loosen their grip. He was fascinated by women, particularly by those whose innocence seemed fragile, easily bruised. Evelyn, with her luminous youth and her reputation already entwined with whispers of scandal, became the embodiment of his fixation. He first encountered her in the world of theater, where her presence already attracted attention. For Harry, it was not enough to admire from a distance. He pursued introductions, pressed for proximity, showered her with attentions. His wealth made such pursuit easy. Tickets to the best seats, gifts of jewelry, promises of security. To a girl raised in poverty, accustomed to the precarious kindness of patrons, his devotion might at first have seemed like a blessing. Yet beneath the surface there was a ferocity in his interest that carried both intensity and danger. Imagine Evelyn in those days, accustomed to the admiration of artists and audiences, now facing a new kind of attention. Harry's devotion was relentless. He lingered near her, pressed his presence into her daily life, spoke with fervor of his intentions. To be loved with such intensity might seem flattering, even intoxicating, but soon the lines between affection and obsession blurred. For Harry, Evelyn was not simply admired, she was claimed, as though her beauty, already commodified by society, must now be owned entirely by him alone. It was not long before his jealousy revealed itself. Harry was consumed by the knowledge of her past, her connection with Stanford White, the architect who had shaped her adolescence. To Harry, White represented corruption, the ruin of Evelyn's innocence. He raged against the man in conversations, seethed with the conviction that White had stolen what he himself valued most. Evelyn became caught between the two, between the older man whose charm had lured her into silken chambers, and the younger heir whose obsessive love demanded retribution. What must it have felt like to be the center of such violent passions, not for who she was, but for what men believed her to represent? Harry pressed gifts upon her, but gifts that came weighted with expectation. Diamonds sparkled, yet beneath their gleam was the command of loyalty. He spoke of marriage, of futures, of purity regained through union. Evelyn, still young, still uncertain of her own path, may have wavered between gratitude and unease. Could she trust the fervor of a man whose moods shifted like storms? Could she anchor her life in the promise of stability offered by someone so unstable? Yet his wealth, his persistence, and perhaps the urging of her mother, who sought security for them all, kept him close by her side. In Harry's presence, Evelyn was both cherished and confined. He adored her beauty, yet his adoration demanded exclusivity, a withdrawal from the wider world that had made her famous. To be the object of such devotion might seem like a gift, but for Evelyn it was a tightening circle. The applause of audiences faded behind her, replaced by the echo of Harry's footsteps always near. The laughter of artists and studios gave way to the stern weight of his demands. She was no longer a muse to be admired by many, but a possession to be guarded by one. The footsteps resound in our imagination, echoing down long corridors, following her wherever she turns. They are heavy, insistent, a reminder that freedom is narrowing. And yet, within that confinement, there remained moments when she might have believed in his care. Harry could be generous, protective, even tender in his fashion. He promised her the safety she had never known, the devotion of a man who would never abandon her as death had claimed her father. Did she ever believe that promise? Or did she sense, even then, that his devotion was a cage from which there would be no escape? Evelyn stood at the threshold of a new chapter, her life already tangled with men whose power overshadowed her own will. From the rustle of silk in hidden rooms to the footsteps of an heir determined to claim her, her path was narrowing into a corridor of choices not her own. And as those footsteps draw ever closer, their echo deep and relentless, we feel the gravity of what is to come. For obsession, once awakened, does not rest until it has consumed its object, and Harry Thaw's footsteps would soon lead both him and Evelyn into a tragedy that the world would remember as the scandal of their age. The corridor falls silent for a moment, as though holding its breath. Evelyn pauses, uncertain, caught between the past that haunts her and the future that presses near. The silence is heavy, waiting to be broken as the story carries us onward. The corridor falls silent, heavy as if the walls themselves were listening. Into that stillness we hear a softer sound, fragile and intimate, the faint crumple of paper pressed in trembling hands. A letter, a confession, words written or spoken that cannot be unsaid. For Evelyn, the weight of her past could not be hidden forever, and in the presence of Harry Thaw, insistent and unrelenting, she revealed what had been locked within her. She told him of Stanford White, of the velvet swing, of the silken rooms where her youth had been consumed, and in the telling she surrendered not only memory but also power. For Harry's obsession would seize upon her confession and shape it into a weapon. It was not easy for her to speak of those years. How could she? She was still young, still struggling to reconcile the contradictions of her own life. To be cherished and exploited, to be adorned and abandoned, such experiences leave scars that do not show on the skin, but remain embedded in the heart. Perhaps she hoped that by confiding in Harry she might find release, that honesty might cleanse what secrecy had burdened. She may have imagined that his love would be strong enough to carry the truth. Yet Harry was not a man who understood balance, nor one who could bear shadows. He demanded purity. He demanded absolutes. And in hearing Evelyn's story, he found not compassion, but fury. The paper crumples again in our minds, as though his hand had seized it, crushed it in rage. Harry's obsession with purity was fierce and unforgiving. To him, Evelyn was both angel and fallen figure, the embodiment of beauty corrupted by another man's desire. His hatred for Stanford White grew like fire, fed by dry wood. He raged that White had stolen what was his, that the architect had destroyed innocence that should have belonged to him alone. Evelyn's confession, offered in hope of trust, became the spark that ignited Harry's darkest impulses. Imagine the scene between them. Evelyn, her voice low, recounting moments she would rather have forgotten, the air heavy with silence. Harry listens, his face shifting from tenderness to fury, from anguish to obsession. He presses her for details, not to understand, but to fuel his anger. Each word she speaks becomes a stone added to the weight he carries. She, perhaps trembling, may have looked for forgiveness, for comfort. Instead, she found herself bound more tightly, her past now shackled to his vengeance. There is cruelty in the way confessions, meant to heal, can become chains. Evelyn had lived in a world where silence was survival, where unspoken memories allowed her to move forward. By breaking that silence, she placed herself in Harry's hands, trusting what should not have been trusted. For him, the knowledge was not a call to gentleness, but a command to action. He saw himself as avenger, as guardian of purity, as the one who must restore honor through destruction. Evelyn's voice, once released, could not be recalled. The echoes of her words filled Harry's mind, driving him toward an inevitable collision. Her mother, too, may have urged the sharing, hoping that honesty would solidify the bond between Evelyn and her suitor. But honesty in such matters does not always bring closeness. It can instead widen the chasm. Harry's possessiveness deepened. He became more insistent, more demanding, more watchful. Evelyn, who had once been the subject of the public's gaze, was now imprisoned within the narrow confines of his private obsession. Where before she was commodified by many, she was now confined by one. The crumpled paper remains in our imagination, its edges bent, its surface scarred with creases. It symbolizes the fragility of trust, how quickly it can be crushed, how easily it can be turned into something dangerous. Evelyn's confession did not free her, it bound her. And as Harry's anger grew, so too did his determination. He spoke of vengeance against White, of punishment, of cleansing. Evelyn, caught between fear and resignation, may have hoped that his words were only storms of temper, that they would pass like summer thunder. Yet within him, the storm was constant, growing in silence, waiting for the moment to break. And so the stage was set. The triangle of Evelyn, White, and Thaw tightened like a knot. Each carried their own perception of the story. White as benefactor and lover, Thaw as avenger and husband, Evelyn as the silent witness whose body had become the battlefield of their desires. She was no longer seen as herself, but as symbol of beauty, of corruption, of purity lost and sought again. The men fought over the meaning of her life, while she herself was left with little voice. The paper in his hand falls to the floor at last, flattened under his shoe, discarded but not forgotten. Its words linger, heavy and immovable. The silence between them is no longer peace but tension. The future bends toward violence, and Evelyn stands in its path, powerless to step aside. And here we pause, with the paper lying crushed, the air dense with unspoken dread. Outside, the city moves in its restless rhythm, unaware of the private storm gathering strength behind closed doors. Inside, a girl and a man sit in silence, the weight of confession pressing down, waiting for what must come. The paper lies crushed beneath his shoe, flattened and silent, but its weight lingers like a shadow in the room. Out of that stillness, our ear catches another sound, faint and distant. The rattle of carriage wheels upon cobblestones, the echo of footsteps in foreign streets, the murmur of voices speaking in accents not her own. For Evelyn's life soon left behind the narrow confines of New York, drawn into the sweep of oceans and boulevards as Harry Thaw carried her across the Atlantic. He cloaked his control in the guise of luxury, wrapped his obsession in the silken folds of travel. But even among the marvels of Europe, Evelyn felt the chill of confinement. What should have been adventure became another form of enclosure, and the cold touch of a window pane was her only companion. Europe at the turn of the century was a place of contrasts, a continent steeped in tradition and yet alive with the tremors of modernity. Paris shimmered with electric lights, Vienna resonated with music, London pulsed with empire's pride. Harry moved them through these cities with the determination of a man showing off his wealth, eager to place his beloved within the settings of grandeur. He booked the finest hotels, commissioned gowns, ushered her into opera houses and gilded salons. Outwardly, it was a life of privilege, a dream that any young girl might envy. Yet for Evelyn, the splendor was heavy with unease, for each gesture of generosity carried the weight of surveillance. Each promise of devotion came bound with restriction. She was watched, always. Harry's gaze did not soften with the marvels of Paris or the beauty of alpine lakes. If anything, it sharpened. He guarded her movements, controlled her encounters, measured her glances. Even among crowds, she was alone, for his jealousy fenced her in more securely than any wall. The grandeur of Europe became for her not freedom, but gilded prison bars. Imagine her seated in the dining room of a grand hotel, chandeliers blazing above, the clink of silverware filling the air. Around her, laughter and conversation, men and women in evening dress enjoying the ease of wealth. And beside her, Harry, his hand firm on her arm, his eyes restless, his voice urgent with possessiveness. She sits quietly, her smile faint, her thoughts far away, pressed against the glass of a window pane cold with night air. In Paris, they walked along the boulevards where artists and writers gathered. Yet Evelyn was not permitted to lose herself among them. She might have yearned for the laughter of students in cafes, for the scent of chestnuts roasting in the streets, for the thrill of blending anonymously with the crowd. But Harry's presence was a tether, pulling her back, reminding her that she was not free to wander. In Vienna, they listened to music that soared with passion and melancholy. But to Evelyn, the notes may have sounded like echoes of a life slipping further from her grasp. The beauty of the old world surrounded her, yet it was beauty glimpsed through a veil, unreachable, distorted by the lens of Harry's possessive desire. And yet, there must have been moments when she looked up at the stained glass windows of cathedrals or watched the sweep of rivers through ancient cities and felt a flicker of something beyond her present. Did she wonder what life might have been if she had come here alone or with companions of her own choosing? Did she imagine herself as one of the independent women she saw strolling with books under their arms or sipping coffee while reading newspapers in cafes? The thought may have been brief, but in its brevity, it revealed the gap between what was and what might have been. Harry's temper, too, did not rest in Europe. His obsession with Stanford White remained sharp, his hatred undimmed by distance. He spoke of vengeance even as they dined under gilded ceilings, his words harsh amid the clatter of cutlery. Evelyn listened, her silence both shield and surrender. She had confessed her past, and now she lived in the shadow of that confession, each moment of travel marked by his need to reassert ownership. In this way, the journey became not escape, but rehearsal for the storm to come, a procession of luxuries masking a deepening descent. Loneliness grew within her, profound and inescapable. Surrounded by finery, she longed for the simplest things, a walk without scrutiny, a conversation without fear, a moment of privacy where her thoughts were her own. The cold glass of the window pane became her confidant. Pressing her hand against it, she could feel the chill seep through her skin, reminding her that even amid warmth and wealth, there remained an absence no gift could fill. Outside, lights twinkled in foreign streets. Voices drifted in languages she could not fully grasp. Inside, she remained silent, watched, and confined. Perhaps she told herself that this was her fate, that beauty brought not freedom, but chains. Perhaps she still hoped, in rare moments, that Harry's devotion might soften, that time and marriage might temper his fury. But beneath such hopes lay the quiet knowledge that the path she walked was narrowing, and that the journey across Europe was not expansion, but preparation for an inevitable reckoning. And so we leave her here, in the grand hotels and gilded theaters, her hand resting on the cold glass of a window, eyes cast outward toward streets alive with strangers she would never meet. The pain divides her from the world, transparent yet unbreakable. Beyond it lies the life she might have lived. Within it lies the life she endures, gilded but solitary. The glass grows colder as night deepens, holding her reflection faintly in its surface, a reflection she scarcely recognizes. The glass grows colder as night deepens, and in its faint reflection, Evelyn sees a pale outline of herself, blurred by the shimmer of lights beyond the street. That fragile reflection dissolves, and in its place another glimmer appears, a circle of gold, a ring catching the light of candles on a polished table. For from the chill of the window pane, we pass into the glow of ceremony, into the binding promise that Harry Thaw pressed upon her. The proposal, insistent and relentless, gave way at last to marriage, though Evelyn's heart was divided between hope and resignation. The ring glittered, but behind its glow lay chains, invisible yet unyielding. Harry's pursuit of marriage had been constant, almost fevered. He spoke of it in every city, in every season, weaving promises of devotion with demands of loyalty. He told Evelyn that their union would cleanse the past, that as his wife she would be restored, protected, untouchable. He painted marriage not as partnership, but as redemption, a ritual through which her history with Stanford White could be erased. To a young woman worn by uncertainty, battered by scandal, and confined by his jealous presence, the offer may have carried a semblance of refuge. Yet even in moments of persuasion, Harry's love bore the sharp edge of command. To refuse him was unthinkable. To accept was inevitable. The wedding, when it came, lacked the warmth of celebration. It was not the joining of two souls bound by affection, but the sealing of a pact weighted with expectation. Evelyn, still scarcely out of girlhood, stood before vows she could neither shape nor escape. Her gown was white, her hands steady, her face serene for the watching eyes. But within, one imagines a swirl of conflicting feelings, a wish for stability, a fear of confinement, a glimmer of hope that marriage might soften his temper, a dread that it would only deepen his control. The candles flickered, the words were spoken, and the ring was placed upon her finger, a circle unbroken, yet also a circle closed. Marriage did not bring release. Instead, it brought new intensity to Harry's possessiveness. Now she was not only his beloved but his wife, his possession legitimized by law and sanctified by ceremony. He grew more vigilant, more suspicious, more insistent upon her obedience. His hatred for Stanford White did not abate. It sharpened further. To him, the marriage was not only a union but a weapon, proof that Evelyn had been reclaimed, that White's shadow could be erased only through violence. Evelyn, bound by vows, stood in the midst of his obsession, powerless to temper its course. Imagine her at the wedding supper, the table laden with food, the guests murmuring congratulations. Harry's eyes rarely left her, his hand gripping hers with a firmness that seemed less affection than assertion. The ring on her finger gleamed as she lifted her glass, yet the glow did not warm her heart. Did she look around the room and feel herself a bride, radiant and cherished? Or did she feel herself enclosed, watched, the ceremony only another step in a narrowing path? Perhaps she smiled, as brides are expected to smile, while inside she measured the distance between the promise of marriage and the reality it already revealed. There's a sorrow in such unions, where hope and dread walk side by side. Evelyn may have told herself that Harry's devotion was proof of love, that his jealousy was born of passion. She may have believed that in time he would settle, that his wealth and position would provide the security her mother longed for. But deep within, she must also have sensed that his storms would not quiet, that the vows had not calmed his rage, but consecrated it. The marriage bed became not sanctuary but stage for his obsessions, where tenderness was entwined with suspicion, where affection was shadowed by accusation. The ring remained on her hand, glinting in candlelight, a constant reminder of the bond she could not undo. It was at once a shield and a shackle. In public, it marked her as wife, elevated her from chorus girl to society lady, granting her legitimacy in the eyes of the world. In private, it bound her more tightly to a man whose demons shaped her every moment. The duality of the ring mirrored the duality of her life, admired and envied from afar, yet controlled and diminished within. As the days unfolded after the wedding, Evelyn's role became more and more that of witness to Harry's obsession. He returned again and again to the subject of White, his words laced with fury, his thoughts circling endlessly around vengeance. She listened, silent, weary, unable to turn him aside. Her marriage had not quieted the conflict between the men, it had only inflamed it. And in her silence lay the seed of tragedy, for she had become the fulcrum upon which their rivalry balanced. The vows spoken in candlelight were not vows of peace, but preludes to violence. And so we leave her in this moment, seated at a table where candles burn low, the ring gleaming faintly upon her hand. The guests drift away, the music fades, the hall grows quiet. She lifts her eyes to the shadows on the wall, the circle of gold heavy on her finger. It is both promise and prison, glinting softly in the dark. The flame of one candle sputters, threatening to go out, and in that fragile flicker lies the uncertainty of all that is to come. The flame of one candle sputters, threatening to go out, its glow wavering across Evelyn's pale face. From that fragile flicker, we move outward into the summer night of New York, where lights burned brighter, where the hum of voices and music filled the rooftop theater garden of Madison Square. The year was 1906, and the air carried the scent of roses mingled with the sharp tang of gaslight. Evelyn stood amid the crowd, her hand encircled by the ring that still glinted faintly, when the quiet sputter of a candle became something far more violent, the crack of gunfire, the sharp scent of gunpowder rising through the warm evening air. In that moment, the story of her life, already entangled in shadows, became forever bound to the words that would echo across headlines: the crime of the century. Madison Square Garden, with its Moorish arches and domed tower, was the pride of Stanford White, the architect whose name still haunted Evelyn's every step. The rooftop theater was alive with music and laughter that June evening, filled with men in dinner jackets and women in gowns, the orchestra playing beneath the stars. Evelyn was there at Harry's side, dressed with the poise expected of a society wife, though within her heart unease trembled. She had heard his words often enough, his vows of vengeance, his muttered threats against White, to know that storm clouds still gathered within him. And yet, how could she have foreseen that the tempest would break so suddenly before so many eyes? Stanford White was there as well, seated at his table, a man of charm and presence even in his later years. To many in the city, he was a figure of genius, the designer of theaters and mansions, a man whose influence touched nearly every grand structure of the age. To Harry Thaw, he was the corrupter, the villain, the rival whose shadow loomed over his marriage. The sight of White across the rooftop garden struck him like a match to powder. He rose, his hand reaching beneath his coat, and in an instant the night was shattered. 3 shots rang out, swift and final, echoing against the rafters and fading into horrified silence. White fell back in his chair, his head bent, his white waistcoat blooming crimson beneath the lights. Evelyn, caught between the men, saw it unfold before her eyes. The crowd gasped, cries rose, women fainted, men surged forward. The orchestra stuttered to a halt, the music falling into dissonance and silence. Smoke curled upward from the pistol in Harry's hand, mingling with the heavy summer air. The scent of gunpowder, acrid and undeniable, hung like a veil over the rooftop. In that moment, Evelyn's face became the silent center of the storm, her beauty no longer muse or commodity but evidence, her life no longer private but spectacle. What must she have felt in that instant? Shock, terror, disbelief. Or perhaps, beneath the immediate horror, a terrible recognition that the words she had heard so often from Harry had at last found their fulfillment. She had listened to his vows of vengeance, to his rants against White, and now she watched as he acted upon them, transforming jealousy into murder. Her past and her present collided in gunfire, and she stood powerless, a witness who could never escape the consequences. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some shouted for police, others pressed forward to see the fallen architect. Reporters would later describe the scene with lurid detail: the bright lights, the screams, the stunned silence of society's elite. Harry, far from fleeing, stood defiantly declaring that he had avenged his wife, that justice had been done. To him, the act was not crime but triumph, the final stroke in a battle that had consumed him. To Evelyn, it was devastation, for with each word he spoke, her name became further entangled in scandal. She was no longer only a chorus girl, no longer only an artist's muse. She was the central figure in a national tragedy, her image fixed forever in the shadows of that rooftop. The sharp scent of gunpowder drifts still in memory, carrying with it the weight of questions that can never be fully answered. Was she victim or catalyst or both? Did her confession to Harry make the act inevitable? Or was it his madness alone that pulled the trigger? Could she have walked away before the vows, before the night, before the crowd? Such questions haunt the story, yet remain unanswerable. What is certain is that in those moments her life ceased to belong to herself. It belonged instead to the newspapers, to the courts, to the endless fascination of a public hungry for scandal. She was ushered away amid the confusion, her face pale, her body trembling. The night air carried shouts and sirens, the rush of feet, the harsh clatter of voices demanding order. In the days to come, her every movement, her every word would be dissected, her beauty placed under harsher lights than any stage could offer. The ring on her finger no longer glinted with promise, but with judgment. She was not merely a bride, not merely a wife. She was the woman at the heart of the crime of the century. And so we leave her in this moment, standing amid the crowd as smoke curls upward and the orchestra falls silent. The scent of gunpowder lingers, sharp and unrelenting, filling the night with its bitter tang. It hangs in the air, unresolved, a reminder that the echo of those shots would not fade with the night, but would carry on into courtrooms, headlines, and the long unraveling of Evelyn's life. The music is gone, the laughter extinguished, and all that remains is the acrid veil of powder drifting into the summer sky. The scent of gunpowder drifts upward into the summer night, its acrid veil lingering even as the crowd disperses, even as White's lifeless form is carried away. That haze does not vanish. It settles into memory, into the marrow of a city, and in time it drifts into another chamber altogether, the solemn hush of a courtroom, where silence is broken, not by music or screams, but by the furious scratching of pencils on paper. Reporters fill the benches, their hands restless, their eyes fixed on Evelyn. The gunfire of Madison Square Garden has given way to the incessant scratching of testimony, for the crime has become spectacle, and her life its evidence. The first trial of Harry Thaw began in early 1907, scarcely months after that fateful night. The courtroom was crowded from the first hour, with society ladies pressing in beside ordinary citizens, all eager to witness what had already been named the crime of the century. Newspapers sent their finest correspondents, and artists sketched the faces of judge, jury, defendant, and, most of all, Evelyn. Every detail mattered: the tilt of her head, the tremor in her voice, the color of her dress. She was no longer simply Evelyn Nesbit, a girl who once sat quietly in studios or danced in chorus lines. She was now the central figure in a national drama, her life unrolled before strangers, her body made into exhibit, her memories cross-examined. Imagine her seated there, slender and pale beneath the heavy gaze of so many eyes. The court air was stifling, thick with perfume and cigar smoke, the creak of benches punctuating the scratching of pencils. The judge presided. The lawyers rose and fell in their arguments, but again and again the focus returned to Evelyn. For Harry's defense rested not merely on his own actions, but on the story of her past, the confession she had once given him in trembling trust. Now it was dragged into the open, repeated for strangers, written down in ink to be read by millions. She told of her youth, of her encounters with Stanford White, of the velvet swing and the rooms draped in silk. Her voice, reporters said, was soft, at times breaking, at times almost inaudible. The crowd leaned forward, eager to catch each word. For them, it was scandal, titillation, the private unveiled in public. For Evelyn, it was a return to wounds she had never wished to expose. She became at once witness and victim, her testimony both truth and spectacle. Did she feel as though her very soul were on trial, judged by the curious eyes of strangers? Likely so, for every detail she offered was seized upon, magnified, and printed in black letters across front pages. The defense painted Harry not as a murderer, but as a protector, a man driven by outrage at the violation of his wife. They spoke of White as predator, corrupter, libertine. They cast Evelyn as the innocent girl, ruined by an older man's lust, redeemed only by Harry's vengeance. Yet innocence is never so simple, never so easily defined. Evelyn, in her own words, tried to speak honestly, but honesty became another chain. The more she confessed, the more she was trapped in the narrative others built around her. She was a symbol to them, not a person. Purity betrayed, beauty defiled, youth corrupted. They did not ask what she desired, only what she endured. The jury listened, the public devoured every headline. The city thrummed with talk of the trial. Cartoonists sketched her face, satirists mocked the courtroom drama, society whispered of nothing else. Outside, newsboys shouted her name until their voices cracked, selling papers that told her story in exaggerated detail. Inside, she sat beneath the glare of attention, her voice trembling, her eyes downcast. Every time the scratch of a pencil reached her ears, she knew another piece of her life was being carried into permanence, fixed like ink upon a page, never again to be her own. Harry sat beside his lawyers, his gaze shifting between fury and triumph. He heard her words as justification, as confirmation that his act was righteous. To him, her testimony was the very shield of his defense. To Evelyn, it was something else entirely, a burden she could not set down, a confession weaponized beyond her control. She may have wondered, as she spoke, whether silence might have been better. Yet silence, too, would have condemned her, for the court, the papers, the crowd, they all demanded her voice. In such demands there is no freedom. The trial stretched on, week after week, each day filled with repetition and scrutiny. The public could not look away. For them, it was theater. The beautiful girl, the jealous husband, the corrupt architect, the murder beneath the lights. For Evelyn, it was exhaustion. She became frail, her cheeks hollow, her eyes shadowed by fatigue. Still the questions came, still the lawyers pressed, still the reporters scribbled. She was trapped in a story she did not write, yet forced to perform it again and again. The verdict, when it came, was not final. The jury could not agree, and the trial ended in deadlock. But the story was far from finished. The pencils did not rest, the headlines did not fade. There would be another trial, another stage upon which Evelyn would be summoned to relive her past. For now, she left the courtroom each day to the flash of cameras and the cries of newsboys, her figure veiled but her face unmistakable. She returned to rooms where silence was heavy, knowing that even in silence she was not free, for her image still traveled in the hands of strangers, her voice still echoed in courtrooms, her name still burned across headlines. And so we leave her here, in the suffocating chamber where pencils scratch like endless insects, capturing every word, every gesture. The sound does not cease, even as the court adjourns, even as night falls. The scratching continues in memory, restless and unresolved, carrying us onward to the next telling, the next judgment, the next trial where her life would again be written by others. The scratching of pencils continues, even as the gavel falls and the day's proceedings end, even as Evelyn is led through the heavy doors into the swirl of evening air. That restless sound becomes something sharper, louder, cast into the open streets, the cry of a newsboy, his voice cracking as he shouts her name to a rushing crowd. "Nesbit! Nesbit!" The syllables fly out into the city, carried on ink-stained fingers clutching newspapers, on the breath of strangers eager for scandal. From the hush of the courtroom to the clamor of the street, Evelyn's life was no longer her own. She had become the girl in the headlines, her face printed larger than presidents, her story repeated until it belonged to everyone but herself. Each morning the presses thundered, turning out thousands of sheets heavy with her image. The ink still wet, the scent acrid. Newsboys held the papers aloft like banners of war. The public could not get enough. Artists sketched her pale profile, her wide eyes, her delicate mouth. Writers described her as angel, temptress, victim, muse. No two portraits agreed, yet all claimed authority. Evelyn was fractured into 1,000 versions, each more vivid than the one before, each obscuring the living woman who still walked through hotel lobbies and narrow hallways with her head lowered. Fame, once flattering, had become suffocation. The fascination lay not only in beauty, but in contradiction. To some, she was a fallen girl redeemed by a husband's vengeance. To others, she was a siren whose charms had driven men to ruin. Still others saw her as proof of society's decay, a chorus girl elevated beyond her station, a symbol of the excess of the age. Evelyn herself remained silent, caught in the whirl of voices. Did she read the papers that shouted her name? Did she scan the lines for fragments of truth? Or did she avert her eyes, knowing that each word was a mirror warped by strangers' hands? Perhaps she read them at first, her heart quickening at every phrase, but in time the flood of words must have overwhelmed her until even curiosity turned to despair. Imagine her stepping from a carriage, the crowd pressing near, men lifting hats, women craning necks to glimpse the face that had become so familiar in print. Cameras flashed, their shutters snapping like insects. She moved through the throng as though in a dream, her veil lowered, her steps quick. To be recognized everywhere, to be named before speaking a word, to feel the eyes of strangers follow each gesture. This is the peculiar weight of celebrity, heavier still when fame is born of tragedy. For Evelyn, each day was a reminder that her face belonged to the world, her story etched in type, beyond erasure. Her image traveled far beyond New York. Across America, in small towns and distant cities, her likeness stared from front pages and magazine covers. In parlors and barber shops, in factories and offices, people argued over her innocence, her guilt, her beauty, her ruin. She was discussed as though she were myth, her life a parable for society's obsessions. Yet behind the myth was a woman barely in her 20s, weary, bewildered, longing perhaps for the obscurity she had once fled. To be poor had been harsh. To be famous proved harsher still. Poverty is cruel in its hunger, but fame consumes in other ways, gnawing at the soul with relentless eyes. The chorus girl who once moved unseen in lines of dancers had now become the singular focus of a nation. No longer anonymous, she was dissected. Her dresses were described in columns, her expressions interpreted like scripture. One paper praised her poise, another mocked her frailty. All agreed that she fascinated, and fascination is a hunger that cannot be sated. Did Evelyn feel herself dissolving, reduced to fragments on paper? Did she glance at her reflection in a mirror and wonder which Evelyn looked back, the one she remembered or the one millions believed they knew? Harry, confined and awaiting judgment, clung to the narrative that Evelyn's testimony secured. He declared himself avenger, she his innocent wife. Yet his triumph meant her unending exposure. For every word she had spoken in court was repeated endlessly, stripped of context, printed as entertainment. What had once been a private confession now belonged to the nation. She could not take it back, could not shield it, could only endure its repetition like a song that would not end. The newsboy's voice still rings in our ear, sharp and insistent. "Nesbit! Nesbit!" The crowd surges, coins clink, papers change hands. The ink smears upon fingers, the pages crumple in pockets, yet her image remains clear, her story undiminished by use. She is everywhere, yet nowhere herself. Fame has consumed her, and the cost is solitude. For how can one be truly known when one's face has been scattered like confetti across the land? How can one find rest when the cries of newsboys never cease? And so we leave her here, her name shouted down crowded streets, the echo carrying into parlors and marketplaces, into every corner of the restless nation. The call fades into the distance, but it does not die. It lingers like a bell that has been struck too hard, resonant and unresolved, leading us onward into the next act of her ordeal, where headlines give way to verdict, and the echo of her name enters the clang of closing iron doors. The cry of the newsboy fades into distance, swallowed by the hum of the city, but its echo lingers like a bell struck too hard. And in the hollow it leaves behind, another sound rises, heavy, metallic, unyielding. It is the clang of a cell door closing, reverberating through stone corridors, sealing a man within, and sealing Evelyn's fate as well. For the first trial had ended not with resolution, but with deadlock. And so the story continued, carrying her once more into courtrooms, headlines, and testimony she could scarcely endure. The second trial would bring no peace. It would bring instead the plea of insanity, the confinement of Harry Thaw, and Evelyn's weary return to the witness stand. After the first jury failed to agree, the city buzzed with speculation. Would there be justice? Would Harry walk free, celebrated as avenger, or would he pay for what many still called cold-blooded murder? The newspapers thrived on the uncertainty, their columns filled with predictions, editorials, and gossip. And always, at the center, was Evelyn. She could not walk a street nor enter a room without feeling the weight of eyes upon her. Her beauty, once her shield, had become a spotlight under which every tremor, every word, every silence was judged. The second trial began in 1908. Again the court was filled to bursting. Again reporters swarmed. Again Evelyn's life was dissected. This time the defense shifted its ground. Harry's lawyers no longer sought justification in vengeance alone. They sought refuge in madness. They painted him as a man unbalanced, driven to violence by obsession, incapable of controlling his fury. The strategy was clear. If not acquittal, then confinement. Not prison, but asylum. To prove it, they again summoned Evelyn, again demanded she tell her story, again forced her to relive the silken rooms and the velvet swing before strangers' eyes. How must it have felt to speak those words a second time? Once might have been unbearable, but twice was torment. The first trial had left her hollow, yet the second demanded she open the same wounds, trace the same scars, offer the same pieces of herself to the public. Her voice, the reporters noted, was softer still, as though drained of vitality. Her eyes, once luminous, seemed shadowed, her figure thinner. She was not the radiant chorus girl of magazine covers, but a young woman worn down by exposure, stripped of privacy, exhausted by repetition. And still the pencils scratched, still the papers printed, still the crowd hung on every word. Harry sat across the room, his gaze fixed on her, his mood swinging between fury and triumph. To him, her testimony was still his shield, his proof that he had acted not as murderer, but as protector. Yet now it served another purpose as well, evidence of the obsession that marked him as unstable. The court listened, the lawyers argued, the public devoured. Evelyn endured. She had no choice. To remain silent would be to betray him. To speak was to betray herself. In either case, she was trapped. The verdict at last came. Harry Thaw was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was to be confined not in prison, but in the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. The clang of the cell door we imagined was in truth the iron gate of an asylum, a place where Harry would live not as convict but as patient, a wealthy man even in confinement. He had escaped the gallows, escaped the penitentiary, but not the shadow of his madness. Evelyn, too, was not freed, for though the trial had ended, her own confinement continued, not behind walls but within the cage of her fame. She left the courtroom with her mother at her side, her steps unsteady, her face pale. Outside, the cameras flashed, the crowd pressed near, the newsboys cried her name again. But what was left of her? She was scarcely 23, yet her youth had been consumed by scandal, her innocence dissected, her image multiplied until she scarcely recognized herself. She returned to private rooms, yet even there the noise of the world intruded, for her story had become national property. Letters arrived, some praising, some condemning, all demanding. Strangers spoke of her as though they knew her, as though she were a character in a play rather than a woman of flesh and sorrow. Harry remained confined, yet still he occupied her life. His family, powerful and wealthy, pressed her to maintain loyalty, to uphold the image of faithful wife. They saw her as ornament to his defense, proof of his redemption, emblem of his honor. But what of her honor? What of her life, her desires, her freedom? These questions lingered, unasked by courts or papers, whispered only in the silence of her own heart. The clang of the asylum gate fades into our ear, heavy and final, yet unresolved. For confinement does not end a story. It only shifts its shape. Evelyn walked out of the courtroom, but she did not walk into peace. She walked into exile of another kind, into years where her name remained burden, where her image still haunted the press, where her future seemed ever overshadowed by the crime that had consumed her past. The iron gate may have closed on Harry, but Evelyn carried her own gate within, unseen yet unbreakable. And so we leave her here, stepping from the courthouse into the press of the crowd, the echo of iron still ringing in her mind. The sound lingers, resonant and cold, carrying us into the long silence that followed, into the years when she sought escape, retreat, and some small measure of self amid a world that would not let her be forgotten. The echo of the iron gate lingers in the ear, metallic and cold, then fades into another sound, softer, yet no less heavy. The slow settling of dust upon a piano in an empty room. The strings within lie silent, their notes unsummoned, their music forgotten. It is here, in this dust-laden quiet, that Evelyn retreated after the trials had ended. No longer the radiant girl of magazine covers, no longer the trembling figure at the witness stand, she drifted into exile, wandering between America and Europe, seeking some place where her name would not be shouted in the streets, where the sound of pencils scratching and headlines crying might finally cease. Yet fame, once loosed, does not fade so easily. It follows like shadow clinging to her wherever she turned. In the months after Harry's confinement, Evelyn's presence in society diminished. Once she had been the focus of every newspaper. Now she was an afterimage, still visible, but dimmer, blurred. She attempted to move through the world unnoticed, but recognition came swiftly. On streets, in theaters, and cafes, people turned their heads. Some whispered in pity, others in disdain. To many, she was the tragic heroine of a story that fascinated them still. To others, she was merely scandal, her name a synonym for disgrace. Either way, she could not escape. Her face had been scattered across too many pages, her story too deeply engraved in the public mind. So she traveled. Paris again, London, small towns in Europe where the language was foreign enough to shield her for a time. There she might sit at a cafe table, her veil drawn low, her coffee growing cold as she watched the life of strangers unfold without recognition. Yet even then, the illusion of freedom was fragile. Now and then, a glance lingered too long, or a whispered word in English cut through the murmur. She was seen again and again. Fame had carried her farther than she could travel, faster than she could flee. It had made her universal, and thus inescapable. Her heart must have grown weary. Once she had dreamed, perhaps, of being admired, of leaving behind poverty and anonymity. Now she longed for obscurity, for the simplicity of life without eyes upon her. The dust on the piano speaks to us of that longing, the desire to be unseen, to live quietly, to let music and life unfold in private without intrusion. Yet obscurity was denied her. Even in exile, her name appeared in columns, her movements reported, her solitude pierced by curiosity. She returned at times to America, but never again with the triumph or radiance of earlier years. The society that had once marveled at her beauty now regarded her with suspicion, even contempt. In some quarters, she was dismissed as a fallen woman, in others as a foolish girl who had courted disaster. She had been too visible, too entangled in scandal to be welcomed back as ordinary. And so she hovered at the edges, a ghost of her former fame, wandering in search of belonging. What did she feel in those wandering years? Was it despair or resignation or some quiet form of hope? Perhaps she told herself that time would soften memory, that eventually her name would fade from headlines, that she might build a life anew. But time moves strangely for those who have been marked by scandal. For some, it erases. For others, it only deepens the grooves. Evelyn's name remained etched, her story told and retold, each telling fixing her more firmly in place. She was no longer a living woman in the eyes of the public. She was symbol, cautionary tale, object of fascination. That burden no journey could lift. Yet exile was not only burden. There may have been moments of peace, brief and fragile. A walk along the Seine at twilight, the lamps flickering upon the water. A morning in a quiet English village where the fog muffled sound and veiled her face. In such moments, she might have felt herself anonymous again, a soul among millions, free to breathe. Did she smile in those moments, however faintly, at the thought that beauty and scandal could not wholly define her? Perhaps. The human heart, even under weight, still seeks light. Still, she could not escape the truth. She was adrift, uncertain of where she belonged. The girl who had once been claimed by artists, by chorus lines, by men of wealth, now belonged to no place and no one. The dust continued to settle on the piano, the strings within untuned, the songs unsung. And Evelyn herself, once the symbol of youthful radiance, lived in silence, her music muted by memory and loss. We leave her here, in a dim room somewhere in Europe or America, the exact place uncertain, the details blurred. The air is heavy, the light filtered through curtains drawn against the street. Dust gathers on the piano lid, a thin film that softens its sheen. Her hand might brush across it, leaving a faint trail, a reminder that she is still present, still breathing, even as the world forgets or distorts her. The notes remain within, waiting to be struck, though the keys lie untouched. Silence reigns. But silence, too, is unresolved, carrying us forward to the next chapter, where Evelyn seeks return, not in solitude, but upon the stage once more. The dust upon the piano lid lies thick, undisturbed, until at last a hand might lift and fall upon the keys, breaking the silence. But in our passage, that gesture transforms into another sound, heavier, more public. The slow descent of a theater curtain, its folds whispering as they drop, ending a performance. For Evelyn, after years of exile, there came a time when silence itself grew unbearable, when the weight of obscurity pressed more harshly than the burden of fame. She stepped again into the glow of the stage, into the uncertain embrace of audiences, not as the ingenue of her youth, but as a woman marked by scandal, attempting return through vaudeville and the early flicker of silent film. Yet the curtain, when it fell, reminded her that time is merciless and that audiences who once adored can as easily turn to curiosity or indifference. In the early 1910s, Evelyn returned to the stage, her name still recognizable, still capable of drawing interest. Managers saw opportunity. Her notoriety guaranteed attention, ticket sales, columns in the papers. And so she was offered parts in vaudeville acts, sketches and recitations, moments on stage designed more to showcase her presence than her talent. She accepted, perhaps out of necessity, perhaps out of longing to reclaim some fragment of her past self. The lights rose once more upon her, the music swelled, the audience murmured with anticipation. Yet she was not the same girl who had once danced in chorus lines, her innocence untouched by scandal. She was Evelyn Nesbit, infamous, her beauty shadowed by memory, her every movement judged against the legend that had grown around her. Imagine her standing before the footlights, the heat of the lamps upon her face, her costume shimmering faintly. She recites lines, or sings, or simply appears, her presence enough to elicit applause. Yet the applause is not like before. It carries a note of curiosity, of prurience, even of mockery. The audience does not see her performance. They see her past. They whisper of Madison Square Garden, of Stanford White, of Harry Thaw. They measure the lines of her face not against the part she plays, but against the image once printed on magazine covers. To them, she is both spectacle and relic, the embodiment of a scandal grown mythic. The curtain falls, the applause echoes, but it does not warm her. It reminds her only that she is remembered not for what she does, but for what she endured. The cruelty of time lay heavily upon her, for beauty, once exalted, is always measured against its own fading. Evelyn, though still young, could not remain the eternal ingenue that the public desired. They had fixed her in memory as the delicate girl of silk and shadows, and any departure from that vision seemed betrayal. On stage, she fought not only for relevance but against the tyranny of an image she could never escape. Each performance was haunted by ghosts, of her younger self, of White, of the trial, of the name that newspapers had inscribed upon her like an unyielding brand. In time, she turned to silent film, that new medium which captured faces in motion and projected them larger than life upon silver screens. Here, too, she sought renewal, a chance to transform herself, to seize the future rather than remain a relic of the past. She appeared in short reels, her expressions magnified for audiences in darkened theaters. Yet film, like stage, offered little mercy. The camera captured her beauty, yes, but also revealed the wear of years, the shadow of sorrow. The public watched not her roles, but her presence, not her character, but her history. Again the whispers, the murmurs, the comparison to scandal. The flickering images could not free her. They only enlarged her prison. The descent of the curtain becomes a rhythm in her life. Again and again she steps upon the stage. Again and again the lights blaze. Again and again the audience responds with curiosity more than admiration. And always the curtain falls, heavy and final, leaving her in darkness, her breath shallow, her spirit weary. The applause fades quickly. The whispers linger. She returns to her dressing room, removes her costume, stares at her reflection in a spotted mirror. Does she see Evelyn Nesbit, the woman she is, or does she see the myth the world has constructed, the girl who can never return? Perhaps she sees both, layered like transparent sheets, blurring her own identity until it is indistinguishable from the legend, the effort of return takes its toll. Though she persists for a time, the stage cannot restore what was lost, nor film provide the redemption she may have sought. The world that once adored her beauty now treats it as curiosity, her fame as novelty, her scandal as commodity. She cannot escape the past, and the present offers little solace. The curtain falls heavier with each attempt, until at last she steps away once more, retreating from performance into the uncertain quiet of private life. And so we leave her here, standing in the wings as the curtain descends, the sound of its folds brushing the stage like a sigh. The audience departs, their voices fading into the night. The theater grows dim, the air heavy with the scent of dust and extinguished lamps. Evelyn remains, her figure outlined in shadow, her eyes fixed on the curtain that separates her from a world she can neither command nor escape. The silence returns, yet it is a silence filled with echoes, unresolved, carrying her onward into years of struggle, where the glitter of the stage is replaced by the flicker of a single candle in a bare room. The silence of the fallen curtain lingers, the folds heavy against the stage, until at last the light shifts and another glow appears, not the blaze of gas lamps above an audience, but the trembling flame of a single candle in a bare room. Its light flickers against plain walls, casting long shadows, revealing more absence than presence. Here, far from the theaters and cameras, Evelyn's life entered its long years of struggle, a period not gilded by fame or softened by applause, but shaped instead by poverty, responsibility, and the fragile pursuit of survival. The silks and velvet that once surrounded her were gone, leaving only memory, frayed and faint. The flame of the candle reminds us how fragile her existence had become, how narrow the circle of her light. She had a son, Russell, whose life became both burden and anchor. Born from her union with Harry Thaw, he carried the name and inheritance of a man confined to an asylum, yet his future was uncertain, shaped by shadows not of his making. Evelyn bore the weight of motherhood with limited means, striving to provide stability in a world that had never offered her any. She took what work she could find, sometimes returning briefly to the stage, sometimes teaching, sometimes surviving on the remnants of support that trickled from the Thaw family. But money was scarce, and the glare of notoriety closed as many doors as it opened. She lived not in splendor, but in modest apartments, rooms where candles replaced chandeliers, where silence replaced music. The contrast with her youth was stark. Once she had been carried into mirrored rooms filled with gifts, adorned in gowns meant to dazzle. Now she mended her own dresses, counted coins for rent, and prayed for enough to keep her child safe. What thoughts passed through her mind as she tucked Russell into bed, watching the candlelight flicker across his face? Did she see in him hope for a new beginning, a chance to give what she herself had been denied? Or did she fear that he too was bound to the weight of her past, his name tied forever to scandal? The truth was likely both. A mother's love mingled with a woman's dread, each night a balance of tenderness and sorrow. She lived quietly, yet the world did not fully forget her. Occasionally her name reappeared in the papers, attached to small performances, interviews, or mentions of her struggles. These brief flashes reminded the public of a scandal they could not quite release, but for Evelyn, they brought little comfort. Fame in fragments is no blessing. It is a ghost that startles but offers no warmth. She remained a curiosity, a relic of a bygone trial, her story retold whenever the nation hungered for sensation. But those retellings did not feed her, nor did they ease her solitude. They were echoes, and echoes cannot sustain life. Imagine her evenings in those rooms, the city's noise muffled by thin walls, the candle her only light. She sits by the window, sewing perhaps, or writing, or simply staring out into the night. The sound of distant carriages drifts upward, mingling with the laughter of those returning from theaters. She remembers the applause, the stage lights, the swirl of music. She remembers the silks and the gilded salons. Yet now she feels only the coarse fabric beneath her fingers, the uneven flame of the candle, the weariness of survival. Memory is both comfort and torment, reminding her of what was lost, of what was squandered, of what was taken. And still she endures, for endurance is all she has left. Her beauty, though diminished by time and hardship, still lingered faintly. Neighbors remarked upon her face, strangers recognized her features even years later. Yet beauty, once her currency, had become almost cruel, a reminder of the past rather than a promise for the future. She no longer sought the gaze of others, for she had learned too well what that gaze could do. Instead, she turned inward, living not for admiration but for quiet survival, for the small circle of light cast by her candle each night. Russell grew, carrying his own burdens, his life inevitably entwined with hers. He bore the scars of a name heavy with scandal, yet he also bore the love of a mother who gave what she could. For Evelyn, his existence was both proof of endurance and reminder of chains she could not escape. She loved him fiercely, yet through him she remained tethered to Harry, the man whose obsession had defined her fate. Motherhood did not release her. It deepened her entanglement, even as it gave her purpose. The candle flickers, its flame bending as though to vanish, then straightening once more. It mirrors Evelyn's own resilience, fragile, uncertain, yet enduring against drafts and darkness. Her life in these years was not glamorous, not celebrated, but it was real, grounded in the simple acts of survival. And though the world may have forgotten her except as symbol, she continued to live, to breathe, to hope quietly for peace. We leave her in this dim room, the candle still burning, its circle of light enclosing her and her son. The shadows stretch across the walls, reaching like silent memories. The silence is heavy but alive, filled with the small sounds of breathing, of sewing, of thought. The candle will burn down, its wax pooling, its wick sputtering. But even as it falters, it holds the dark at bay, just as Evelyn, weary yet enduring, held her life together in the long, silent years after Scandal. The flame wavers unresolved, carrying us forward to another light, this time not from wax but from ink drying on a page, as Evelyn turns to writing her own story at last. The candle sputters, its flame bending low, until at last the silence of the room is broken, not by voices nor applause, but by another sound, faint and deliberate, the scratch of a pen moving across paper. In this shift we see Evelyn not beneath stage lights nor courtroom glare, but bent over pages, her hand steady, her eyes fixed upon words that flowed like fragments of her own memory. For in the later years of her long ordeal, she turned to writing, to the fragile hope that by setting down her story, she might reclaim it, or at least shape it in her own voice. The book she produced bore the title Prodigal Days, and within its pages she sought to transform her life from scandal into testament, from symbol into human being. The ink that dried upon those sheets was more than narrative. It was her attempt at freedom. The act of writing must have been both painful and necessary. How often had she seen her name distorted, her story twisted, her image fractured by newspapers and strangers? For years, others had told her tale, always with their own motives, lawyers seeking defense, reporters seeking headlines, audiences seeking entertainment. Now at last the pen was in her hand, the page her own. She wrote not for spectacle, but for remembrance, not for sensation, but for survival. Each word was a reclaiming, a stitch in the torn fabric of her life, a fragile attempt to bind together fragments scattered by time and tragedy. Yet even as she wrote, Evelyn must have known that memory cannot be made whole. How to describe the rooms draped in velvet without inviting judgment? How to speak of Harry's obsession without reviving the fury of the past. How to tell of her son, her struggles, her long years of silence without seeming to plead for pity. Memory is never pure. It is shadowed by what we wish to forget, blurred by what we cannot clearly recall. And so her words carried both truth and hesitation, both revelation and concealment. To read them is to glimpse not only her story, but also her yearning for a story that might have been. Prodigal Days was not a triumph in the way she might have hoped. Critics were indifferent, the public curious but distracted. The scandal that had once made her name famous now weighed heavily, turning readers toward salacious detail rather than the quieter reflections she offered. Some dismissed the book as self-justification, others as tired confession. Yet within its pages, those who listened closely could hear the voice of a woman still struggling to define herself, still longing to be seen not as symbol, but as self. That alone gives the work its poignancy. For even if the world did not care, Evelyn had at last spoken in her own hand. Imagine her at a small table, the lamp casting a narrow circle of light, her pen moving slowly across the page. Outside, the night deepens. The city hums faintly beyond the window. She pauses often, staring into the distance, her mind revisiting rooms long abandoned, faces long gone. Sometimes the words flow with ease, as though memory demands release. Sometimes the pen hovers, reluctant, the silence of the page heavier than speech. She writes through fatigue, through uncertainty, through the shadows of the past. And as she writes, perhaps she feels a measure of control, a rare moment when her life is hers again, even if only between the margins of paper. The book's title speaks volumes. Prodigal Days. The phrase suggests wandering, waste, loss, and perhaps return. It is both confession and lament, an acknowledgement that years of her youth were consumed by forces beyond her command, yet also an affirmation that those years, however prodigal, still belonged to her. She claimed them by naming them, by setting them into words. In doing so, she challenged the narrative others had built around her. She was not only the girl in the swing, not only the bride of the Avenger, not only the face in the headlines, she was Evelyn, a woman whose life was fractured but not erased. And yet, what solace did writing truly bring? Did she feel lighter when the manuscript was complete? Or did she feel the burden more sharply, knowing that her words would never fully erase the distortions of others? Perhaps both, for writing does not cure. It clarifies. It sets down fragments that might otherwise be lost, but it cannot rewrite the world's memory. Still, the act itself was an assertion, a refusal to be silent, a reaching for dignity in a life where dignity had so often been denied. The ink dries on the page, the lamp flickers low, the pen rests at last upon the table. Evelyn closes the manuscript, her hand lingering upon the cover, her eyes tired but resolute. The room is silent again, yet the silence is changed. It is no longer only the silence of exile, but also the silence that follows expression, the pause after words have been spoken. Whether or not the world listens, she has spoken, and in that act lies a measure of peace. We leave her here, seated in the dim circle of lamplight, the manuscript before her, the pen still stained with ink. The pages rest like fragile witnesses, carrying her story outward into a world that may not receive it as she hoped, but that cannot erase the fact that she has told it. The silence of the room returns, but beneath it, we hear the faintest echo of paper rustling, as though her words were stirring, ready to travel. The ink is dry, but its mark is indelible, and in that unresolved stillness, we move forward to another kind of preservation, not of words, but of images, as her likeness, once spread across magazines, continues to echo long after her voice has quieted. The rustle of manuscript pages drifts into silence, their ink drying into permanence, and from that hush, another sound arises, faint, almost imperceptible, the soft shifting of a photograph left upon a windowsill, stirred by a passing breeze. Its edges curl in the light, its image fading but still discernible, the face of a girl whose beauty once captivated a nation. Though Evelyn's own voice had sought to reclaim her story in ink, her image continued its own life, detached from her, enduring as artifact, as icon, as symbol. In photographs, in illustrations, in the stylized line of the Gibson girl, Evelyn Nesbit persisted long after the world had ceased to listen to her words. Her likeness lingered in albums and archives, passed across generations, a strange immortality that bore little resemblance to the woman who aged and struggled in obscurity. At the dawn of the 20th century, America had been hungry for faces to adore, and Evelyn's had been among the first to be chosen, reproduced, and scattered. That hunger did not entirely abate with scandal. If anything, scandal made her likeness more enduring, more sought after. Decades later, when her life had quieted, when her name no longer graced the headlines daily, collectors and historians still returned to her photographs. They saw not the weary woman of later years, but the luminous girl of 1900, her eyes wide, her hair coiled in elaborate style, her expression a blend of innocence and suggestion. That face, once her burden, became her legacy. Yet what does it mean to live on as an image while the self that once inhabited it fades into shadow? The photograph on the windowsill captures that tension. The light strikes its surface, bringing her features to life for a moment, only to reveal the yellowing of paper, the fading of ink. She remains, and yet she does not. The Evelyn of the image is eternal, suspended in youth, untouched by time. The Evelyn of flesh endured hardship, poverty, survival. Between the two lies a gap unbridgeable, a silence no photograph can fill. And yet the world remembers the photograph more readily than the life. The girl in the picture has become myth, while the woman herself slips into obscurity. Artists, too, contributed to this afterlife. The Gibson girl, that idealized vision of American femininity, bore traces of Evelyn's features. Though she was not the only model, her likeness influenced the archetype, embedding her in the cultural imagination. She became both individual and symbol, muse and myth. Even as her name faded from popular speech, her face lingered, recognizable in the elegant lines of drawings, in the sepia tones of old magazines, in the archives of early 20th century beauty. To the world, she remained eternal. To herself, she was fragmentary, struggling against the dissonance between image and existence. What must it have felt like to know that her face lived on in photographs even as her own body aged? Her hair grayed, her hands grew frail. Did she ever hold one of those old prints in her hands, staring at the youthful girl who gazed back at her? Did she recognize herself, or did she see a stranger, a phantom of someone she once was? Perhaps she felt both recognition and estrangement. Pride and sorrow mingled together. For to see oneself immortalized in youth is both gift and torment. Gift in that beauty endures, torment in that it no longer belongs to the living self. The world often forgets the cost of such endurance. An image preserved does not preserve the life that produced it. It detaches, becomes its own thing, subject to the interpretations and desires of others. Evelyn became emblematic of the Gilded Age, of beauty commodified, of scandal consumed as spectacle. In later decades, her photographs appeared in retrospectives, her story retold in books and films. Yet rarely did these retellings consider the quiet years of her survival, the struggles she endured in small rooms, the candlelight nights with her son. They remembered only the face, the myth, the tragedy. The person within remained unseen. And yet perhaps there is some solace in that endurance. For while many lives vanish entirely, Evelyn's remained, however distorted. Her image became part of a larger history, woven into the fabric of a nation's obsession with fame, beauty, and scandal. To be remembered, even imperfectly, is to resist oblivion. And in her faded photographs, in the yellowing pages of magazines, Evelyn still gazes outward, her eyes capturing the attention of those who look upon her a century later. She becomes, in that way, timeless, even as her own life slipped into time's relentless current. The photograph on the windowsill shifts again, the breeze stirring its edges. The light catches it, illuminating the young girl's face, then fades as the sun moves. The image remains, but the light changes, reminding us that even immortality is subject to the rhythm of days. Evelyn, the living woman, was moving inexorably toward her final years, her face lined by struggle, her body weary. Yet her image remained suspended, eternal and unresolved. The two coexist side by side, the girl in the photograph and the woman who still lived, teaching quietly, working modestly, unseen by most. The photograph endures, while the person drifts further into shadow. And so we leave her here, her likeness resting in the light of a windowsill, her eyes fixed on a horizon she could not reach. The breeze stirs again, and the photograph flutters, unresolved, carrying us forward to another horizon, the long twilight of her final years, when Evelyn herself faded into near-forgotten quiet by the Pacific tide, even as her image lived on. The photograph flutters once in the breeze, its paper curling at the edges, then settles back into stillness upon the sill. From that faint stir we move outward, beyond rooms and windows, beyond the confines of memory and ink, into a wider sound that carries its own ceaseless rhythm, the hush of ocean waves against the shore. It is the Pacific at dusk, eternal and patient, where the tide advances and retreats with no audience but the gulls above and the winds that shape the coast. It was here, in California, that Evelyn Nesbit passed her final years, far removed from the lights of Broadway, the glare of courtrooms, and the ceaseless cry of newsboys. At last she lived quietly, not as Muse nor Scandal, but as a woman growing old beside the sea. She came to California in middle age, when her name had already faded from daily speech, when Scandal had cooled into history. The westward move was, in a sense, exile, but also refuge. Here she was less recognized, her face not so familiar, her story not so loudly whispered. The Pacific coast, with its rugged cliffs and open horizons, offered a kind of anonymity that New York had long denied her. In small houses along quiet streets, she taught art, passed on what she knew of line and shadow, helped others find beauty through discipline rather than exploitation. To students, she was perhaps simply Mrs. Thaw, or perhaps just Evelyn, a teacher whose eyes carried both kindness and sorrow. Few, if any of them, could have grasped that their instructor had once been at the heart of what had been called the greatest scandal of the age. The ocean must have spoken to her in its own language. Each wave carried the weight of constancy, rising and falling like memory itself. In the evenings, when the sun sank into the horizon and painted the water with gold and crimson, Evelyn may have walked along the shore, her steps slow, her thoughts mingled with the rhythm of the tide. Did she find peace there, listening to the waves wash against stone? Or did the sound remind her of echoes, of the endless repetition of her own story in the world's memory? Perhaps both. For the sea is both comfort and reminder, vast enough to embrace sorrow, relentless enough to reflect it back. Her later years were marked not by grandeur, but by modest survival. She lived simply, her income from teaching and occasional small appearances never abundant. Yet simplicity may have offered its own kind of dignity. No longer was she paraded as spectacle. No longer was her face splashed across the front pages. She could buy groceries, mend clothes, sweep her own porch without cameras watching. For a woman whose youth had been consumed by the gaze of others, obscurity must have felt, at least at times, like relief. To walk unremarked is a freedom easily overlooked. But for Evelyn, it may have been the greatest gift of all. Still, the past was not erased. Journalists occasionally sought her out, curious to know what had become of the girl once called the most beautiful in America. Interviews appeared, though less sensational than before, portraying her as reflective, resigned, sometimes wistful. She did not deny her past, but neither did she dwell upon it. She spoke of art, of teaching, of quiet contentment. Yet beneath her words one senses a lingering sadness, the unspoken recognition that her life had been shaped less by her own choices than by the desires and obsessions of men, by the appetite of a society eager to consume beauty and scandal alike. Her son Russell remained a presence in her life, though his path was troubled by the same shadow that had pursued her. The Thaw name, though wealthy, brought complication. The Nesbit name, though legendary, brought weight. Evelyn did what she could, but the legacy of scandal is not easily escaped. Even in her later years, she carried not only her own burdens, but those of her child, a reminder that the past does not fade quietly, even when the ocean whispers of renewal. Imagine her in a small California house at twilight. The windows are open to the salt breeze, the faint sound of waves drifting inward. On a table rests a sketchbook, its pages filled with the drawings of her students. The room is plain, the furniture modest, but the air is calm. She sits by the window, her hair now gray, her hands lined, her face marked by years, yet still carrying traces of the beauty once immortalized. She gazes at the horizon, the line where water meets sky, and for a moment she seems at peace. The world that once clamored for her attention is distant now, softened by time. Here, at the edge of the continent, she belongs not to the crowd but to herself. Her final years unfolded quietly, without scandal, without headlines. She died in 1967, at the age of 82, almost forgotten by the world that had once obsessed over her. To many, her name meant little. To others, it was a half-remembered echo from a story long past. Yet the photographs endured. The myth remained. The legend of the velvet swing and the rooftop crime still told. Evelyn herself had slipped away. Her body returned to dust, her voice silenced. But her image lingered, eternal, as if the girl she once was still leaned forward from the pages of history, her eyes wide, her expression unreadable. And so we leave her here, not in the glare of cameras nor in the tumult of trials, but in the hush of the Pacific at dusk. The waves move steadily, eternal and unbroken, their rhythm carrying her memory into the vastness of time. The horizon glows, the tide retreats, the air cools with evening. She sits in shadow, the sound of the sea, her final audience, its applause endless, but gentle. The water washes upon the shore, unresolved, carrying us onward to the last reflection, the closing of her story, the question of what her life truly meant, and the image of a face fading, but never gone. The hush of the Pacific waves continues, steady and eternal, until it softens into something even more fragile. The faint afterimage of a face dissolving into shadow as though recalled in memory just before sleep. It is Evelyn's face, once so luminous, once so endlessly reproduced, now fading like a photograph left too long in the sun. And in this dissolving light we are left to ask what remains, what meaning can be drawn from a life that was both spectacle and solitude, triumph and tragedy. Was she victim, survivor, or symbol? Or was she all three? Her existence never fully her own, her image claimed by others even as she struggled to remain herself. To call her victim is to see clearly the exploitation of her youth, the way older men bent her beauty to their desires, the way poverty left her unprotected, the way her confession was seized upon and weaponized. She was used by White, who adorned her in silks while stealing her innocence, by Thaw, who bound her to his obsession and called it devotion, by the press, who stripped her story for headlines until little remained of the girl herself. She was victim, undeniably, of a society that consumed beauty and discarded it, of an age that saw women more as ornament than as soul. And yet, to stop there would be to deny her endurance. She survived. She lived decades beyond the trial, beyond the scandal, beyond the whispers. She bore a son. She taught. She wrote. She walked along the Pacific shore. She endured when others might have been destroyed, carrying her burdens with a quiet dignity the world rarely acknowledged. Survival is not triumph in the conventional sense. It does not dazzle or inspire headlines, but it is its own kind of victory, quiet and profound. To live to 82 after such a beginning is a testament in itself. To call her symbol is to recognize how her image outlived her body, how her face became emblematic of an entire age. She was the chorus girl elevated to goddess, the muse of artists, the figure at the heart of the crime of the century, the cautionary tale whispered to young women, the fascination of historians long after her death. She was not only herself, she was made into metaphor, for innocence betrayed, for beauty commodified, for the dangers of fame, for the obsessions of men. In this sense, she became more than woman. She became archetype, a mirror in which the Gilded Age saw its own desires and fears. But what did Evelyn herself desire? What meaning did she seek in her life, once the lights dimmed and the applause ended? Her memoirs hint at longing, at regret, at an attempt to reclaim dignity through her own words. Her teaching in California speaks of a wish to pass something on, to find worth in guiding others. Her quiet years suggest a yearning for peace, for the simple human dignity of being unremarkable. Perhaps her greatest wish was neither to be victim nor symbol, but simply to be Evelyn, daughter, mother, woman. Yet history rarely grants such simplicity to those it marks. The afterimage of her face lingers still. In it, we see the paradox of memory, beauty eternal, life fragile. The eyes remain wide, luminous, untouched by time, even as the woman who bore them aged, struggled, and died in obscurity. To look upon her photograph is to be deceived, for it suggests eternity while concealing suffering. Yet perhaps that is the fate of all who become icons. The face remembered, the life forgotten. Still, in contemplating Evelyn, we are reminded that behind every image lies a soul, complex and wounded, yearning for recognition not as myth, but as self. And what, then, is her legacy? It is caution and lament, yes, but also reflection. Her story invites us to question the cost of beauty, the appetite of society for scandal, the imbalance of power between men and women in an age of excess. It warns of the dangers of fame, of how swiftly admiration can turn to commodification, how quickly a life can be consumed by narrative. And yet it also speaks to endurance, to the quiet persistence of a woman who lived long after her own legend was written, who found a measure of peace beside the sea. The Pacific waves continue their hush, eternal and indifferent. The afterimage of her face fades further, dissolving into shadow, but not vanishing entirely. It remains, faint but present, in archives, in photographs, in memory. It is neither angel nor temptress, neither holy victim nor holy survivor. It is Evelyn Nesbit, a woman who lived a life both extraordinary and tragic, whose story resists simple conclusions, whose image lingers like the final note of a song unresolved. We close our eyes and still we see her, fading, elusive yet enduring, carried onward like a whisper by the tide. And so the story ends not with resolution but with quiet reflection. The waves recede, the face dissolves, the night deepens. Evelyn remains, somewhere between memory and myth, her life both warning and wonder. The Pacific murmurs on, indifferent yet eternal, and in its sound we hear the echo of her days, prodigal yet human, fragile yet unforgotten.